Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive into the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain.
That's right.
It's a fascinating period of history full of, you know, big changes and lasting impact. So I think it's, perfect for a deep dive.
Definitely. I'm excited to get into it.
So we know our listeners are really interested in understanding why the Anglo-Saxons decided to migrate to Britain in the first place.
Right. And what impact they had.
Exactly. And to help us uncover all of this, we've got a whole stack of sources from Britannica to, some really interesting academic
There's
papers.
so much to explore.
I know, right? So, to give everyone a little taste of what's to come, we'll be looking into some really intriguing theories, like the possibility that the Anglo-Saxons were actually invited by a British king.
Oh, yeah. That's a story full of debate and mystery.
It is, and we'll also be delving into the huge impact they had on the English language.
I mean, a ton of the words we use every day come straight from Old English.
It's incredible, isn't
Yeah.
it? But before we get ahead of ourselves, maybe we should start with the basics. So who exactly were the Anglo-Saxons?
Well, the term Anglo-Saxons actually refers to a mix of Germanic tribes.
Okay, so not just one group.
Right. Not a single unified group. We're talking about the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes.
Ah, okay, I've definitely heard those names before.
Yeah, they're pretty central to this whole story. So picture this northern Germany and southern Scandinavia about 1600 years ago. That was their home turf.
Got it. So they weren't native to Britain?
Nope, they came from across the sea,
Hmm.
and they were known for their warrior culture, strong and skilled fighters, but also skilled farmers and craftspeople.
So they're a pretty capable bunch, huh? It makes you wonder what would make them want to leave their homeland and, set sail for a whole new land.
Well, imagine their homeland for a second. They were dealing with some serious environmental challenges like flooding, a lack of fertile land for farming, and constant warfare between tribes.
Oh, wow. So not exactly a peaceful paradise.
Not really. It was a tough place to live. So when you consider that and then look at Britain at the time, it starts to make sense.
What was happening in Britain that would make it seem so appealing?
Well, for one, the Romans had recently left, which left a bit of a power vacuum.
Ah, so there was an opportunity there.
Exactly. And compared to their homeland, Britain had fertile land, a more favorable climate. It must seem like a pretty attractive option.
A real land of opportunity.
You could say that. And there's another layer to this. Some sources suggest that there might have already been Anglo-Saxons in Britain serving as Roman soldiers even before the main migration happened.
Oh, wow. So they might have had some firsthand knowledge of the place?
Possibly. It definitely adds an interesting wrinkle to the story.
It does. This whole idea of them coming to Britain reminds me of that story about King Vortigern.
Ah, yes, King Vortigern.
The British king who supposedly invited the Anglo-Saxons to help him fight off other invaders.
That's the one. It's a great story, but to be honest, historians still debate whether King Vortigern even existed.
Really? So he might just be a legend.
It's possible. It just goes to show that history is full of these intriguing mysteries and unanswered questions.
It definitely keeps things interesting. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the Anglo-Saxons and why they might have come to Britain. But before we dive deeper, I think it's important to set the stage.
Right.
What was Britain like before the Anglo-Saxons arrived?
Okay, so picture Britain at that time. It was inhabited by Celtic peoples with their own distinct cultures, religions, and, they were skilled warriors in their own right.
Right, so there was already a well-established society in place?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And don't forget the Romans, they'd ruled Britain for nearly 400 years, leaving behind a huge impact on everything from infrastructure like towns, roads, bathhouses, you name it.
Wow. So they really made their mark.
Oh, yeah, they did. By the time the Anglo-Saxons showed up, Britain was already this mix of Celtic and Roman influences. It was a pretty diverse place.
Fascinating. So it sounds like the Anglo-Saxons weren't just arriving in some empty, unclaimed land.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They were stepping into a complex and dynamic society.
So what happened when these different groups collided? I mean, did the Anglo-Saxons just completely wipe out the existing Romano-British culture?
That's a question that sparks a lot of debate among historians.
Really? So there's no easy answer.
Not really. Some believe the Anglo-Saxons were this dominant force who quickly replaced the existing culture, while others see it as a more gradual process of assimilation and integration.
So a bit of a historical puzzle then.
You could say that it was a tumultuous time with different cultures jostling for position and influence.
I can imagine. Speaking of clashing cultures, I'm curious about the impact the Anglo-Saxons had on Britain. What were some of the big changes they brought about?
Well, their impact was huge, and in some ways it's still felt today. I mean, just
Yeah.
think about the English language.
Oh, right, because their language was Old English, right?
Exactly. And modern English is a direct descendant of Old English. So the language we speak today is a testament to their influence.
That's pretty amazing. And it wasn't just language, right? They had major impact on the political landscape as well, didn't they?
They did. They established kingdoms across Britain, and those kingdoms eventually merged to form the nation of England.
Wow. So the very existence of England can be traced back to the Anglo-Saxons.
That's right. And we can't forget the cultural exchange that happened between the Anglo-Saxons and the existing Celtic and Roman populations. Their traditions blended together, creating something new and unique.
So it was a real melting pot of cultures.
Definitely. And their innovations in farming and building techniques also left a lasting mark on the landscape of Britain.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned the heavy plow earlier.
Yeah, that's a great example. It allowed them to cultivate land that was previously difficult to farm, and it had a huge impact on agricultural production.
So the food we eat today could be indirectly influenced by the farming practices of the Anglo-Saxons. That's pretty cool.
It is. It shows how interconnected history is.
It does. But they didn't just arrive and start plowing fields, right? What about their beliefs? I mean, they arrived as pagans, but we know that Christianity eventually became the dominant religion in England.
That's right. And that transition from paganism to Christianity is a fascinating story in itself.
Okay, so tell me more about that. How did that shift happen, and what were the consequences?
Well, it's a complex story, and to understand it, we need to delve a bit deeper into the religious and political landscape of the time.
Okay, so let's do that.
Sounds good.
I'm ready to dive in.
Let's go.
All right, so we've got these pagan warriors who transformed into these Christian farmers, and they're out there shaping the landscape of Britain. It's starting to sound like like an epic story.
It really is. And that transition from paganism to Christianity, that's a really pivotal moment in their history and for Britain as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, was this conversion like a sudden thing? What would make them abandon their traditional beliefs and, embrace this whole new religion?
Well, it wasn't like a overnight switch, where everyone suddenly woke up Christian. It was a gradual process that unfolded over time, influenced by a bunch of different factors.
Okay, so what were some of those factors? Like, what pushed them towards Christianity?
Well, a key event was the arrival of St. Augustine in 597 AD. He was sent by Pope Gregory I specifically to convert the Anglo-Saxons.
Ah, so a missionary from Rome.
Exactly. And his mission had a significant impact.
So was it like a top-down approach to conversion? Did the Anglo-Saxon kings just say, okay, everyone, new religion time?
Haha, not quite. While the support of rulers like King Ethelbert of Kent played a role, it wasn't that simple.
Okay, so there was more to it than just a royal decree.
Yeah, a lot more. Imagine a society where religion is woven into like every aspect of life, social customs, political alliances, even their understanding of the world around them.
Yeah.
So the adoption of Christianity, it offered some new opportunities.
Like what kind of opportunities?
Well, for one, it opened up connections with powerful figures in Europe through the church.
Ah, so give them a seat at the table, so to speak.
Exactly. And monasteries became centers of learning and literacy.
Yeah.
So Christianity also offered a path to knowledge and education.
That makes sense. And it probably helped to unify those diverse groups under a shared faith, right?
Exactly. Christianity provided a framework for unity in a society that was still, finding its footing.
It's fascinating how religion could play such a pivotal role in shaping a society.
It really is. And let's not forget the cultural impact that came along with Christianity. It brought new ideas about morality, justice, the afterlife.
A whole new way of seeing the world.
Right. It also introduced new forms of art, architecture, and literature.
Oh, yeah, like those illuminated manuscripts, the ones with the intricate designs and colorful illustrations. They're incredible.
They are. They're a testament to the artistic skill and devotion of the Anglo-Saxons who created them.
Absolutely. But, it wasn't all monasteries and manuscripts.
Yeah.
What about the everyday lives of the Anglo-Saxons? How was their society structured?
So their society was very hierarchical, with a strong emphasis on kinship and loyalty.
Okay, so family and loyalty were really important.
Extremely important. At the top, you had the kings who held a lot of power, but they were also bound by this complex system of oaths and obligations.
So it wasn't just absolute power.
No, there were checks and balances in place. Then below the kings, you had the nobles or thanes who served as advisors and warriors.
Okay, and where did the everyday people fit into all of this?
So below the nobles, you had the freemen who made up the majority of the population. They worked the land, farmed, raised livestock, that sort of thing.
So they were the backbone of the society.
Exactly. And then at the bottom of the social ladder, sadly, you had slaves. They were often prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt.
So a pretty rigid social structure with not a lot of room for movement.
Well, to some extent, yes, but there were ways for people to move up or down the ladder.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, a free man could gain status through bravery in battle or by accumulating wealth.
So hard work and a bit of luck could change your fortune.
Exactly. And on the flip side, someone could lose their status through crime or misfortune. Remember the war guild system we talked about earlier?
Right, the whole pay for your crimes thing.
Yeah, that played a crucial role in maintaining social order.
It's interesting how they had this system in place to deal with disputes and, maintain some level of balance within their society.
It was a way to keep things from spiraling out of control.
It makes sense.
Oh.
But what about beyond their own communities? We've talked about them being skilled seafarers and traders. So who are they trading with and what were they trading?
Well, they were part of this vast trade network that stretched across Europe and beyond. Imagine woolen textiles, fine metalwork, even slaves, sadly.
Oh, wow. So they were connected to all sorts of different cultures.
They were. They traded with the Franks in what's now France, the Frisians along the North Sea coast, and even as far as Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire.
So a truly international network.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much they accomplished, considering they started out as, migrants seeking a new home.
It is remarkable, and their achievements went beyond trade. Remember those stories and poems I mentioned?
Oh, yeah, the ones that were passed down orally.
Exactly. Their oral tradition was incredibly rich, and eventually some of those tales were written down, giving us works like the epic poem Beowulf.
Beowulf. Dragons, monsters, epic battles. What's not to love? But these stories weren't just for entertainment, were they?
No, they served a much deeper purpose. They were a way to transmit their values, history beliefs, across generations.
So they were preserving their culture through these stories.
Exactly. They're like a window into their worldview, their understanding of heroism, fate, the struggle between good and evil.
It makes you wonder how much of our own modern storytelling is influenced by those ancient traditions.
It's a fascinating thought. And their artistic legacy extends beyond storytelling. The Anglo-Saxons were also skilled metalworkers, creating these intricate jewelry weapons and decorative objects.
Like those beautiful brooches and swords you see in museums.
Yeah.
The craftsmanship is just incredible.
It is. They clearly had a deep respect for artistry and beauty.
And it wasn't just limited to the elite, right?
Right. Even everyday objects like tools and pottery often had decorative elements. It speaks volumes about their values and their desire to find beauty in the mundane.
It's inspiring to see how they weren't just focused on survival. They were creating a vibrant and complex culture.
They were, and that's something that's often overlooked when we talk about the Anglo-Saxons.
It is. But, their arrival wasn't all about art and culture. There was conflict, too, wasn't there? What happened to the native Britons who were already living in Britain?
That's a complex question, and historians are still debating the specifics.
Really? So there's no clear consensus?
Not exactly. Some argue that the Anglo-Saxons violently displaced or even eradicated the native Britons, while others believe there was more integration and coexistence with both cultures influencing each other over time.
So the story isn't as simple as, Anglo-Saxons arrive, Britons disappear.
Not at all. The archaeological evidence is complex and often open to interpretation. What we can say for sure is that the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was a major turning point in British history, leading to profound changes in language, culture, social structures.
It's fascinating how a single event can have such ripple effects across time.
It really is. And that's what makes studying history so captivating. You never know what you'll uncover or what new perspectives you'll gain.
Yeah, it really does seem like the more we learn about the Anglo-Saxons, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
That's so true. It's like we're piecing together this massive puzzle, and every new discovery just reveals more and more of the complexity and the nuance of the past.
Speaking of puzzles, you mentioned earlier that there's still debate about how violent the Anglo-Saxon migration really was. What are some of the arguments on both sides of that?
Okay, so some historians, they point to accounts of battles and conquests in sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Right.
They argue that the archaeological record also supports a narrative of, widespread violence. There's evidence of settlements being abandoned or destroyed around the time of the Anglo-Saxon arrival.
So it paints a picture of a forceful takeover,
Yeah.
which I guess kind of fits with that warrior image we often associate with the Anglo-Saxons.
It does. But then on the other hand, some historians argue that the evidence of violence might be overstated.
Okay, also.
Well, they point to the fact that the Anglo-Saxon migration took place over a long period of time.
Right, it wasn't just like a sudden invasion.
Exactly. And there's evidence of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange between the Anglo-Saxons and the native Britons.
So maybe it was more of a gradual process with both conflict and cooperation happening, at different times and in different places.
Exactly. And it's also really important to remember that the sources we have can be biased or incomplete.
Right, because they were written from a particular perspective.
Exactly. For example, many of the written accounts were produced by Christian monks.
Okay.
And they might have had a vested interest in portraying the Anglo-Saxons as, these victorious warriors spreading the true faith.
So we have to be careful not to take those sources at face value.
Definitely. It's like we said before, history is an ongoing conversation. We're always learning new things, reinterpreting the evidence.
And with new technologies and research methods, we're constantly gaining new insights.
Exactly. Like with genetics and DNA analysis, we're getting a much clearer picture of the mixing of populations that occurred during this period.
Oh, wow. So we can actually trace those genetic connections.
We can. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the story of Anglo-Saxon Britain is a story of multiple groups interacting and influencing each other over time.
So maybe it's not so much a question of us versus them, but rather a story of how these different groups ultimately came together to create something new.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from studying the Anglo-Saxon settlement. It reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray, and even seemingly distant events can have this profound impact on who we are today.
It's incredible to think about how those events from centuries ago are still shaping our world.
It is. And speaking of impact, we started this deep dive talking about the lasting legacy of the Anglo-Saxons. What would you say is their most significant contribution to British history?
That's a tough question. Their influence is so widespread, it's hard to pick just one thing.
I know, right? But I'd say their most enduring legacy is probably their language. Old English, the language they brought with them, is the foundation of modern English.
It's amazing to think that so many of the words we use every day have their roots in the language spoken by those Germanic tribes who crossed the sea all those centuries ago.
It is. And beyond language, they laid the groundwork for many of the institutions and traditions that would come to define England, from its legal system to its monarchy. Their impact is undeniable.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We've covered so much ground, from the origins of the Anglo-Saxons to their lasting legacy on British culture.
It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Likewise. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've just scratched the surface, and there's a whole world of resources out there waiting to be explored.
Exactly. We've mentioned Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but there are countless books, articles, even podcasts that delve even deeper into this topic.
So for all our listeners out there who are eager to learn more, don't be afraid to dig in and do some exploring of your own.
Absolutely. And as you continue your exploration, remember to keep asking questions, challenging assumptions, and piecing together the puzzle of the past. It's a journey full of surprises and rewards.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until our next deep dive, happy exploring, everyone.